knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. You came by grind, came by ambition. It was pain, not love, writing in the kitchen. Most gonna hear what I'm saying, but who's gonna listen? I use music as a way of life. It's more than words I deliver on the mic. What's the details? If no CDs, what's your email? Living missions from first listen. You knew that this was different. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. You came by vision, eyes focus on roads is bumpy. We call mistakes potholes. Riches being healthy, time balance with a good soul. Where's my time gone? I'm in the zone, not figured out. Peso bets ever took a harder route. Truth to talk about, but why lie? I survive off myself. CD burner in the sky is my help and nothing else. And knowledge ain't free. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention.
Hey everybody, shalom and greetings. Welcome to another episode of Illuminated Minds. I am your host, Don Yehuda. Today we're going to be covering the book 103 Facts About the Black Indians. In today's episode, we're uncovering the often overlooked and misunderstood history of Black Indians, or indigenous peoples of North America who are classified as Negroes. This complex history is crucial to understanding the true narrative of American history. If you're interested in deep dives like this, don't forget to subscribe to the Fire Talk Radio podcast channel. The link is in the description below. So let's start. Let's look at fact number 11. I want to start with fact number 11 within this book. It reads, the dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were reclassified during the 17 and 1800s as Negroes and colors. Now, the term Negro and colors was historically used to classify both Africans and Native Americans in the 1700s. This classification wasn't just based on physical appearance, but was also a legal and social tool that deeply influenced how people lived and interacted within society. So, this term Negro or colored was not just attached to a physical appearance, similar today with the term Black or African American. It's not attributed to your skin color. That is the misconceived notion that's pushed, or the narrative that's pushed to the masses, but it's really a legal and social tool that creates a caste system within society. The term Negro derives from the Latin word niger, meaning black. The term entered common usage in the early modern period via Portuguese and Spanish, where it also meant black and was used to describe people of African descent. Now, dodge the hijack. Anytime that they use the term African, it's used in reference to skin color. It doesn't necessarily denote the geographical location of certain people groups and where they originated. It's like when you look in the history, they would use the terms such as Ethiopian to describe people of color. So you always have to be knowledgeable and read the context as it's being used for certain words and terms. All right, so let's move on to fact number 2. Contrary to the common narrative, Black Indians were not procreated from Africans coming from Africa. Instead, the term Black Indian refers to the dark-skinned indigenous peoples of the Americas. These communities existed long before the transatlantic slave trade and have a unique history that predates European colonialization. There has been a lot of commentary as of late pertaining to the indigenous Americans and who they truly are, what they look like, their phenotype, things of that nature, by various content creators, researchers, independent or likewise. But there's many documents citing what the phenotype of the indigenous Americans looked like prior to the European colonization. And them being quote unquote Black Indian was not tied into the bringing of African slaves, so to say, here to the Americas. For example, Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, during his voyage along the North American coast, modern-day U.S., described the Native Americans he encountered in what is now the Carolinas, and I quote, "They are of dark color, not unlike the Ethiopians. Their hair is black and thick and not very long, tied back behind the head like a small tail. As for the physique of these men, they are well proportioned, of medium height, and very strong," end quote. And this is a letter to King Francis I of France during 1524. Verrazzano compares the indigenous people to Ethiopians, a comparison also seen in early descriptions of Africans by Europeans, highlighting the darker skin tones of some indigenous groups. Also, we could take a look at the Spanish historian Francisco López de Gomara in his work Historia General de las Indias. Describes the indigenous people of Mexico and Mesoamerica. Quote, "The natives of New Spain are of good stature and better built than the Spaniards. They are somewhat dark, with black eyes and straight black hair. They do not have beards, nor do they need to shave because they have little or no facial hair," end quote. That is Francisco López de Gomara, Historia General de las Indias, 1554. Now you see that Gomara's description highlights the straight black hair and lack of facial hair commonly noted in European accounts of indigenous peoples. Let's take a look at another quote by Jean de Lery. Jean de Lery, a French Protestant missionary and explorer, wrote about his experiences with the Tupinambé people of Brazil in his work History of a Voyage to the Land of Brazil. Quote, "Their skin is not as dark as Ethiopians, but rather a reddish brown, like a chestnut color. Their hair is black and straight, and they wear it long, down to their shoulders. Their features are sharp, and their eyes are dark and lovely," end quote. And this is from 1578. And I really like this passage because he gives a better description of the phenotypical color of the people, which is reddish brown. If you notice that most so-called African Americans, indigenous people of color, they're not a very dark complected people. They're actually a reddish brown, how would you say it? A ruddy type of color, so to say. So this is very telling of what the phenotype as far as skin color is concerned of what the indigenous Americans who were classified or reclassified as Negroes looked like in pre-colonial times. All right, let's take a look at fact number 14. So fact number 14 in this book states, certain dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were given an ultimatum: go to Oklahoma and be an Indian on a reservation, or stay where you're at and be reclassified as a Negro of color. We can find a lot of evidence that supports this fact that they were reclassified as Negro and was given an ultimatum. There was a lot of legislation put in place at the time that were in hopes of confiscating the lands of the indigenous populace for the benefit of the colonialists that came upon this land. There were such acts as the Indian Removal Act of 1830, right? The Indian Removal Act authorized the U.S. government to negotiate treaties aimed at relocating Native Americans tribes west of the Mississippi River. This policy facilitated the forced expulsion of tens of thousands of Native Americans, notably during events like the Trail of Tears, where many were pressured to abandon their lands. The act contributed to the systematic ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples and often led to their misclassification as Negro or other categories in legal frameworks which emphasize racial binarism. So you have the Indian Removal Act of 1830. You also have the Dawes Act of 1887. The Dawes Act aimed to assimilate Native Americans into American society by dividing tribal lands into individual allotments. This policy encouraged individual land ownership, which fundamentally undermined communal land practices integral to Native American cultures. As a result, many indigenous people were reclassified, sometimes as Negro or other racial categories, especially those who did not relocate to designated reservations. The act led to a loss of over 90 million acres of tribal land and severely disrupted tribal governance and identity. So we see that, the government that was implemented here eventually started confiscating the lands and then started giving ultimatums, so to say, and passing legislation to confiscate the lands from the indigenous populace here and started reclassifying them as Negroes. So a lot of times when you see that term Negro, it doesn't always apply to a quote unquote African person or a person of African descent. It also applies or is attributed to the indigenous populace in many cases here in the Americas. This was a forced choice that was a broader effort to erase the indigenous identities and to assimilate these communities into a Eurocentric society. So always keep that in mind. This is not necessarily taught in school. Matter of fact, it's not really taught in school at all. This is independent research and independent reading that you have to do to come across this information. And there's plenty of information, like I said, as of late, content creators have been really harping upon the identity of the indigenous Americans, who they are, who they descend from, or who are their descendants, should I say, and likewise. So just do your research on that. Don't never take any of our words as the law. You need to do your own research, but there's plenty of evidence that show that in many contexts that Negro did not just apply to people of African descent. With that stated, let's move on to fact number 16. Fact number 16 states, dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, who embraced the Spanish culture during the colonial era, either by choice or by force, have found themselves engulfed or assimilated into Spanish culture and the Spanish language. Now, most of them have lost the knowledge of themselves and their true identity. They too have been reclassified as Latino or Hispanic. Very interesting. A lot of our Latino and Hispanic brothers and sisters fell under the same reclassification as the other sects of indigenous Americans and brothers and sisters of African descent. And I just want to put a side note in there when I say African descent. There's much documentation as to who these so-called Africans were that came from the west coast of Africa. Many, if not most of them, were not even from the west coast of Africa, but that's another subject for another day. But we're going to get into that. But they were just brought from those areas because they were initially placed in those areas from areas such as Portugal and other European areas. So just keep that in mind. We're going to touch on that another time, but they were not necessarily of African descent. So back to the brothers and sisters that's now classified as Latino and Hispanic. When you look into the history of America's colonization, America was colonized by Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. So, it goes to show that in each one of these areas that these different countries were colonizing and taking over, that their language, their classifications, and so forth were being implemented within those areas. It was not a one size fit all, so to say. All of these areas were being implemented under their respective colonial governments that were being established at that time. So we noticed that in a lot of the Hispanic areas is where Spain had came in and took over. So this is why you have the language of Spanish being spoken by Hispanics and Latinos. You know what I'm saying? And over in the English-speaking colonies were the Britons, or they were colonized by Britain, and so forth and so on. So this is what transpired with our brothers and sisters in the Latin Hispanic communities. Fact number 17 is particularly intriguing. Some indigenous Americans were found to speak Hebrew. Luis de Torres, who accompanied Columbus on his voyages, spoke 3 languages, including Hebrew, and noted this remarkable linguistic connection in the New World. This discovery has fueled theories about the origins of indigenous peoples and their possible connections to ancient civilizations. And see, we could read that also in a book titled Lost Tribes and Promised Lands, The Origins of American Racism by author Ronald Sanders. Chapter 8, page 92 states, "We do not know much concerning Columbus's crew. Of about 90 men aboard the 3 ships, but at least one of them was an Israelite, whose presence as such was not merely accidental. This was Luis de Torres, a convert of possibly only that year, who had once held a position with the governor Murcia. He was said to have known Hebrew, Aramaic, and some Arabic, and had been brought along by Columbus specifically as an interpreter. One of the purposes of the voyage, as we have seen, was to find the Great Khan, and Torres was to be the mouthpiece for this encounter, presumably as the basis of his Hebrew. Perhaps Columbus and his supporters had decided that the Great Khan reported on by Marco Polo and others might be the Israelite king who dwelt across the river from Prester John." So what we could take out of that excerpt from the book is that Luis de Torres was an interpreter, and he spoke 3 languages, and they brought him mainly because of the Hebrew that he knew, right? And when you look at artifacts that were found here, some of the oldest Hebraic artifacts were found over here in the Americas. One such artifact is the Decalogue Stone, also known as Los Lunas Mystery Stone, or the Commandment Rock. This was found in New Mexico, Los Lunas, New Mexico, and it is dated possibly to 500 to 2,000 years old. So this is one out of many artifacts that was found over here that is tied into the Hebraic community. So let's take a look at fact number 20 in this book. This is a meat pack, I will have to say. There's a lot of interesting facts that was placed in this book, 103 of them to be honest with you. So fact number 20 says, James Adair in his book, History of the American Indian, wrote 23 arguments to support his findings that the so-called American Indians were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. So fact 20 concerning James Adair in his book, History of the American Indian, argues that the indigenous peoples of the Americas descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Adair's theory, while controversial, suggests a deep and ancient connection between the indigenous people of the Americas and the biblical narratives of the Old. Now, among a lot of the Israelite communities here in America, they believe that the lost 10 tribes actually came over to the Americas by way of 2nd Esdras chapter 13, verses 40 through 45. You also could see movies such as 1492, Conquest of Paradise, because in this movie it shows that there was a reference made to the prophet Esdras by
Why do you wish to sail west?
To open a new route to Asia. Asia is the richest kingdom, the land of spices and gold. At the moment, there are only two ways of reaching it. By sea, sailing around the African continent. The journey takes a year. Or by land. But the Turks have closed this route to all Christians. There is a third way. By sailing west across the ocean sea.
The distance is unknown. It's said to be infinite.
Superstition. I believe the Indies are no more than 750 leagues west of the Canary Islands.
How can you be so certain?
The calculations of Toscanelli, Marin de Tir, Esdras.
Esdras is a Jew.
So what's worse?
2 minutes, and already you're a dead man.
For telling the truth?
Yes. We are burning people for less.
Columbus. There's other books, many books and material that substantiate or at least, highlight the theory of the connection between the indigenous people of America and the biblical characters and the biblical narrative concerning the nation of Israel. That kind of coincides with what we just touched on as far as with the artifacts. Like I said, there's many artifacts that's been discovered here in the Americas that's been tied into the biblical community. So it might be safe to say that there is some credence to the theories and the beliefs that many of the indigenous populace may be able to trace their ancestry back to the biblical narrative and the people of the book known as the Israelites. All right, so let's jump to number 51. And it states, most Buffalo soldiers were black Indians, dispatched by the U.S. Army to assist in the colonizing and confiscation of other black Indian lands west of the Mississippi River. Reservation natives who don't know the true history and who are also brainwashed by images feel that the Buffalo soldiers, who are all ill mistaken and ill classified as African Americans, helped the pale-face drive them off their lands and onto reservations. This last aspect of things, however, is true. In addition to this, one must keep in mind that most reservation natives are hybrid descendants of the true indigenous seed. So these soldiers played a crucial role in the American West, the Buffalo Soldiers I'm speaking of, embodying both African and Native American heritage. Their contributions to American history are significant, yet their identities have often been overlooked or simplified. Fact number 72. During the 16th through the 19th centuries, black Indians migrated from their ancestral lands in what is now known as North America to much older ancestral lands in the Mexican, Central, and South American regions. This exodus was a result of both pale-skinned and dark-skinned European invasion. So 72 discusses the exodus of quote-unquote black Indians to Central South America from the 16th through the 19th centuries, right? This migration was largely driven by the oppressive conditions imposed by European colonization. And what is telling, what might fly over a lot of people's head, is the distinction that I like that they put in here, is that it wasn't only pale skin, but dark skinned European invaders as well. What we're normally not taught in history is that a lot of the Europeans that came over here were dark skinned Europeans. They were not all quote unquote what you would classify as white Euro colonists of today. A lot of them were of dark-skinned complexion or melanated people coming from those areas that came over here and set up shop, so to say. But we're not taught this in school. A lot of time there's a narrative. You have to understand there's a narrative that's being pushed, and there's an erasure of history and actual facts that's actually documented. They don't, the information isn't destroyed, but it's not promoted, and it's not, put in the viewpoint of the masses to understand this history. So you have to know that there's a group of people or institutions that is pushing a particular narrative to drive certain responses, certain ideologies and viewpoints across not only the nation but the world, right? And so it says they were these groups that were involved in the exodus were seeking refuge from what was happening. These communities moved south where they continued to influence the cultural landscapes of their new homes, right? So this was a very monumental exodus, and the exodus was generally termed the southward migration or the southern expansion of indigenous peoples. It characterized various movements of indigenous groups across the continent, particularly during the periods of initial settlement by the white and black colonizers, when populations moved southward along the west coast and through inland routes. They have genetic studies that indicate these southward migrations, which involve significant gene flow and interaction among diverse indigenous groups, which established distinct cultural and genetic lineages across the Americas as the populations adapted to new environments. So a lot of these things you can see, we can go and look these up. And finally, the last fact or point I want to bring out of this book, there's 103 of them. I only did so many. We can always come back to the book, highlight more facts that was brought out in this book, which I think I will cover in future episodes. But fact number 3 provides insight into the complex identities of Black indigenous Americans. Depending on which European nation they intermingle with, their identities were altered, right? So let's take a look at fact number 3. Depending upon which European nation Indians had intercourse with or formed treaties with, also depended upon how their identity was eventually altered. Black Indian nations who had intercourse with Spain eventually became known as the colonized titles of Latino and Hispanic. Black Indians who had intercourse with the French became known by the colonized titles of Creole, Black French, and Haitian. Black Indians who had intercourse with the British became known by the colonized titles of Negro and Color. Black Indians who became victims of British subjugation are still going through colonized title changes. For the moment, they are presently known as Black Americans and African Americans. Interesting. So we see that the Black Indians who intermingled with the French became known as Creoles, Black French, and Haitians. You have your Latinos and Hispanics who were reclassified from their subjugation by the Spanish government. And then you have the Negroes or colored who were subjugated by the British. And so, like they mentioned at the end part, our people are still under subjugation. Why? Because these titles and terms are still relevant today. All of us, whether you're in the so-called Black or African community, whether you're in the Latino or Hispanic community, whether you're in the island communities of the Caribbean, such as Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, so forth and so on, all of these areas and many more were reclassified in a caste system between owners and servants, masters and servants. And so we still hold on to these titles that we erroneously think are nationalities in many cases, but are the bottom of the caste system, and we're still under subjugation to this day. And it's very prevalent that we start doing the research and we start implementing the information that we've read, that we've verified, and start making changes, not only mentally, but legally and self-identification wise, so that way we can start raising out of the muck of where our varied but unified systems or social classes have been for many, many decades, if not centuries. So with that being stated, this book is a very profound book. I came across it a long time ago. When I first came across it, they were trying to say the book was like $100 and something, if not more. I could be wrong. It could have been 1,000, but it was some astronomical number. But it's definitely a good book. I'm going to link the PDF down in the description, so that way anybody that's interested, you don't have to go searching for it. You can just go to the description, download the link. I have it available to anybody who wants to download the link. So with that being said, we're going to wrap up today's video. Remember that this is just the beginning. To explore these topics even further, be sure to subscribe to the Fire Talk Radio podcast, where we dive deep into history, culture, and the untold stories that shape our world. Thank you for tuning in for 103 facts about the Black Indians. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and join the conversation in all the comments below. For more in-depth exploration, head over to the Fire Talk Radio podcast. The link is in the description. With that, shalom, and have a nice day.
Follow me. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. You came by grind, came by ambition. It was pain, not love, writing in the kitchen. Most gonna hear what I'm saying, but who's gonna listen? I use music as a way of life. It's more than words I deliver on the mic. What's the details? If no CDs, what's your email? Living missions from first listen. You knew this was different. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. You came by vision, eyes focus on roads is bumpy. We call mistakes potholes. Riches being healthy, time balance with a good soul. Where's my time gone? I'm in the zone, not figured out. Peso bets ever took a harder route. Truth to talk about, but why lie? I survive off myself. CD burner in the sky is my help and nothing else. And knowledge ain't free. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. Days going by, I just get better. Nights going high, I adapt better. No bad neighborhood, the energy is you. I have been around the worst and the sales always come through. Judgmental situations makes the mind blind. Give you good music, all I see in my sharp eyes. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. I keep pushing, I'm the pusher with good intention. There's no weakness, being self. I play the game I create. Stay focused, get self-paid. Audio knowledge built from a wise design. A man's brain stuck in his own times. I'm education plus entertainment. All mistakes waving. Those hard times made me more patient. The best ever, there is no debating. Unsigned or signed, you sign for a loss waiting. If it's competition, but now this is music for respect. Knowledge ain't free, take cash, no check. Yeah. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. Listen.